Hi everybody, it's Lauren and welcome back to my channel. It is now April, which means that it is Autism Acceptance Month, and in honor of the occasion I'm going to be sharing my top 3 favorite books with autistic protagonists written by autistic authors. So in third place is Queens of Geek by Jen Wilde, which is a YA romance novel that I think is best summarized by what it says on the cover: 3 friends, 2 love stories, 1 convention. It's written from the perspectives of 2 high school seniors who are visiting Los Angeles for the first time from Australia to go to this big convention, which is basically a fictional version of Comic-Con. One of the girls, Charlie, is Chinese Australian and bisexual, and she's at Comic-Con as a speaker for one of the panels because she was just in a huge movie that's supposed to get her own spin-off sequel without the other main character, who was played by her douchey, cheating ex-boyfriend. And unfortunately, she spends a lot of her weekend at the convention trying to avoid him while she's trying to put her energy towards hanging out with her friends and promoting her movie and meeting her fans and falling in love with a very famous YouTube star whom she's had the hugest crush on for a very long time. And then we have Taylor, who is our autistic protagonist, and she is kind of struggling with dealing with all of the major changes and the overstimulation of such a big convention. And she is absolutely determined to enjoy herself at the con, even though the whole thing is very overwhelming for her. Her story has to do a lot with conquering her fears, doing things that make her uncomfortable, and stretching her limits without overstretching herself to a point where it's unhealthy. The book itself is probably not going to win a Prince Award anytime soon, but it's cute and it's enjoyable, and it has some really important representation, particularly with a bisexual woman of color and an autistic woman who has a love interest, because something that happens with people on the spectrum a lot is that they get desexualized and kind of having those parts of their lives that are interested in romance and are interested in sex completely erased. I'm also really happy to see such a close friendship between a really outgoing girl and a really reserved girl, because there's this sort of mythos that I'm frustrated of seeing where you can't have 2 very disparate personalities, especially when they're women, having a very close friendship. So I absolutely adore their relationship. I think it's supportive and it's beautiful, and I think that was honestly my favorite part of the book. Reading about Taylor and Charlie prioritizing each other's well-being, even though they're both going through a lot over this weekend. So in second place is On the Edge of Gone by Corinna Dalvis. This is a dystopian set in the relatively near future where this huge comet is predicted to hit Earth, wiping out most of civilization. So ever since getting that report, most of the human race has been trying to find ways to survive the virtual apocalypse, including permanent shelters and temporary shelters and bunkers funded by rich people, and generation spaceships, which are particularly hard to get onto. The story follows a teenager named Denise and her mother in Amsterdam, where they're trying to get onto a generation ship that had previously been kept very secret, and they're struggling to get themselves places because passengers who are useful are prioritized. As such, the book has a great deal of commentary on familial loyalty and practicality, and if we have the right to choose who is more worthy of survival than others. When I first picked it up, I assumed that that whole thing was going to be about Denise being autistic and is she useful enough to be on the generation ship? And while that is a part of it, it's actually a great deal more nuanced than that. With all of the characters she runs into, we see a broad range of reactions to people finding out that she's on the spectrum, including some really despicable reactions, some really heartwarming ones, and everything in between. But some other things that's also touched on is, should Denise's mother, who's a drug addict, be allowed onto the ship because she's pretty much useless and she doesn't want to try to get clean and become a hard worker again. And also there's a priority for younger people who can reproduce and continue on the human race, on the generation ship. So since Denise's sister Iris is trans, and in her case she can't have biological children, and also, should babies or young children be prioritized over older adults? This is a really good book and it tackles a lot of frustrating topics. I did personally find it kind of difficult to read at times because I'm an emotional sponge, and there are just some painful scenes that made me have to close the book for a little while. And the narrative is very revealing because we get a really good look into how Denise sees the world, which I think is invaluable for neurotypicals because there's a massive amount of ignorance about what it's actually like to have autism. And fiction is a fantastic way to help people understand other different people. Before you pick this up, I do want to emphasize that it is not a space odyssey. The entire book takes place on Earth. The plot is about Denise trying to get herself and her family onto the generation ship. So I've seen some reviews that were disappointed that they had expected this grand space odyssey. So if you pick it up, I just want to make sure you're going into it with the correct expectations. And in first place, a book that I read last year and very quickly climbed its way to my absolute favorites list is Failure to Communicate by Kaya Sonderby. I talked about this one a little bit in my 2018 wrap-up. This is another book where, since the narrator is autistic, we get an amazing look into how her brain works and how she interacts with people and how she interprets things and how she sees the universe. And I say universe because this is science fiction. I don't know if I'd call it a space odyssey, but it's in space. It is set 4,000 years in the future when humans are a part of this intergalactic alliance with a bunch of other species. And our main girl, Xandri Coralel, is the head Xeno liaison on the starship Carpathia, which means she's largely responsible for a lot of first contact missions and learning how to communicate with other sentient species. And her autism actually gives her an interesting advantage here because she doesn't have the same assumptions that most neurotypical humans would. So when she learns to communicate with someone, like learning their language, their body language, their social customs, she starts from the ground up, from a very data-driven, scientific, observationally based standpoint. So in terms of plot, Xandri is tasked with trying to negotiate some sort of alliance with this incredibly xenophobic species called the Anne Morelli. And it's become an incredibly high priority that they get the Anne Morelli on their side, and by they, I mean the alliance. Because as it turns out, the Anne Morelli have developed this crazy powerful super weapon. And like most rational people, the members of the alliance do not want it turned on them. So Xandri is dealing with some unbelievably high stakes here with her job, and she has to do it with the pressure from the intergalactic government and navigating very foreign customs and hostile world leaders and people being straight up prejudiced and making assumptions about her based on the fact that they know that she's autistic, even though a lot of the time it turns out they don't really understand jack. Failure to Communicate has a prequel called Testing Pandora and a sequel called Tone of Voice. I have read all three books and I recommend reading them in chronological order, but the prequel and sequel are only available as Kindle ebooks. So unfortunately, this is the only one in hard copy print. And I'm pretty sure that's because it was independently published and not particularly popular, and I want this book to get more recognition. I love it so much. Xandri is a fascinating and relatable character, and she has such a sense of humor. She has this amazing sarcasm that just makes me so incredibly happy when I read it. I could probably go on and on about this book for a while, but I do have to end the video and I don't want to keep you guys here for an entire hour. So a couple of fiction books that I did not mention because I have not read them but have gotten some really fantastic reviews on Goodreads are Chameleon Moon by Roanna Silver. This is kind of fantasy sci-fi-ish. I'm not entirely sure which one, but it's about a bunch of superhumans who are trapped in a quarantine city that is on fire. So you can see why it could be fantasy or science fiction. Superpowers kind of fall into both. I do not have it, but it looks really interesting, so I want to get it somehow. I have this thing called a budget, which means I can't buy books all the time. The other book is a romance novel called The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hong. The main character, Stella, is an incredibly successful professional, and she's getting pressure from her family to meet a man and settle down with him. And Stella is very inexperienced and deeply uncomfortable with the whole dating, romance, sex stuff. And she figures practice makes perfect, so her solution is to hire a male escort to teach her all of the things that she needs to know. I'm not totally sure if I want to read this one or not. The Kiss Quotient has gotten some attention on BookTube already, and I've heard mostly good things about it and some minor criticisms. I'm just not totally sure if I want to read it because romance isn't usually my bag, but do people still say bag? But I did enjoy Queens of Geek, so you never know. I am uploading this video on April 2nd because it is International Autism Awareness Day, and a lot of people are going to be participating in the Light It Up Blue campaign, which was started by the organization Autism Speaks, which from the many autistic people who have told me as such, is a hate group disguised as a charity. I'm not super familiar with all of the horrible things that Autism Speaks does personally, but I do tend to trust people in a marginalized group when they tell me something is horrible to them and I'm not in that group. So to counter the Light It Up Blue campaign, autism advocacy organizations have started the hashtag Redinstead, where people are encouraged to wear red and light it up red, I suppose, instead of blue on April 2nd to support listening to autistic self-advocates. I'll be linking some articles, nonprofits, and charities in the description below. I strongly urge you to check it out because disabled voices tend to get very shouted down. Voices from the disability community tend to get suppressed a lot. So this is me trying to be a good ally. I hope I didn't screw it up too much. Up in the cards, I'll also be linking the channels of some autistic YouTubers and this video that I found very enlightening called Things Autistic Women Wish You Knew. I'm pretty sure that's the title, but I really liked that video and I'll be linking it. And now to step down from my soapbox. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed making this video because I really love some of these books. If for whatever reason you want to follow me on my social media, I've got all of my links in the description. If you've read any of these books, including the ones that I mentioned but didn't read, and you have thoughts, or you have other own voices, actually autistic author book recommendations that you've read that I didn't mention, please leave it in the comments below. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you really like this video and want to see more content from my channel, hit that subscribe button and I will see you next time.